Welcome back to the Genesis of Conception. I am your hostess, Rebecca David, and this is the space between the picket lines. Now, in our last video, we covered part 2 of the human trafficking connection, which focused specifically on aborted fetal body part trafficking and how it relates to the abortion industry. This week, we are going to take a look at the my body, my choice argument, or as some like to call it, the bodily autonomy argument. And I'm going to explain why it doesn't really make much sense at all once you get past the bare minimum surface level. Thank you very kindly for joining me on this journey today. Alright, y'all, I'm going to start you guys off today with a fun fact. The first person to coin my body, my choice was actually a guy. His name was Donatien Alphonse Franco, or Francois. He was the Marquis de Sade. He was a French nobleman, revolutionary, politician, philosopher, and writer who was famous for his libertine sexuality, which is really just a fancy way of saying that he was known as a man of virtually zero restraint when it came to his sexual stuff. So before we get too far in, I'm going to point out that I actually have another video in this series that touches on today's concept while delving further into some other things. It's called the Proofs of Humanity argument, and you should see it somewhere on the screen. Now, for the pivotal question today. What does bodily autonomy actually entail? Now, interestingly, Merriam-Webster had no definition for the phrase bodily autonomy, so I had to get a little bit creative. It defines autonomy as the quality or state of being self-governing. It also defines body as a human being or a person. So, if we combine those two, then bodily autonomy is defined as the self-governance that a human person has over him or herself. Seems pretty straightforward, right? So, you, as a human being, get to say what happens to you and what does not happen to you. Me as a human being, I get the same thing. So this is why violations of bodily autonomy, such as, but not limited to, rape or being beaten against your will or a whole plethora of other things, are considered to be horrendous. Because when those things occur, what is happening is that someone who is not you is choosing to do harm to you against your will. That's key. Now that's a direct violation of your right to self-governance. But the catch is that in the same way that you have bodily autonomy over yourself, others do also. This includes the segments of the population that we might not commonly think about when it comes to bodily autonomy. A couple of examples are the voiceless and the disabled. Now, allow me to dig a little further on this. Say that there is a person who is maybe deaf, or they're mute, or they have some other either minor or major hindrance, which makes communication either difficult or impossible. Great example of this one from history, Helen Keller. Now, you would still grant that person bodily autonomy, or at least I would hope that you would. Now, by way of another example, take someone who has some kind of incredible deformity, and this deformity causes them to rely on others for care. Maybe they've got cerebral palsy, or possibly they're a paraplegic, or maybe they're missing limbs. Goodness only knows what it could be. Stephen Hawking, excellent example of this type of person. Those people are also granted bodily autonomy. So it's not just how you treat yourself, or how you should be treated, but also how everyone around you gets to be treated, because it's an all-encompassing concept. It's not a question of convenience, but rather one of equality. Either the scale exists all the way around, or it does not exist at all. Which means that if we can prove that the life growing inside of a womb is a human being, then that human being has the same right to bodily autonomy that you and I do. Now, as it just so happens, my first 3 videos in this series go about proving that exact fact, and you should see them somewhere on the screen. But let me take it a step further for you. Human Life International has an incredible article regarding the top 3 reasons why people use the my body, my choice argument in regards to aborting the preborn child. The first, the fetus or the unborn child relies on the mother completely for its existence. The second is that the fetus is inside of her body and therefore it is part of her body, so bodily autonomy doesn't count. Third, the fetus is a parasite. Now, on the surface, these arguments seem virtually insurmountable. They give you a pause to think about their merit. The article then goes on to give counter-arguments. And while you are taking that pause to think, allow me to offer the surmised version with a little bit of my own flair. So, for counter-argument number 1, which counters the argument that the fetus or the unborn child relies on the mother completely for its existence, therefore you can kill it. So while it is true that the unborn child relies on the mother completely for his or her existence, the same thing is true for basically all of this child's childhood and growing up years after birth. In fact, a parent's responsibility to care for their children until those children can adequately care for themselves and figure out the world on their own. This is so pivotal that abandonment or maltreatment or abuse of any kind are punishable by jail time and fees and the children being removed from the home and placed with parents who will care for them properly. Carrying this idea even farther, I'm currently in college, so I know quite a few of grown individuals, aka 18 years or older, who would be incapable of operating in the adult world without relying almost completely on their parents because they're learning how to be on their own. A child's all-encompassing need for parental help and supervision and guidance does not cease once they exit the womb. In fact, you could argue it's just getting started. Just as it would be wrong to murder a child post-birth because of their reliance on their parent or their parents, it is also wrong within the womb. Counter-argument 2, which counters the concept that the fetus is in the mother's body, which makes it a part of her body. Now, as I stated earlier, I have an entire other video detailing all of the reasons why this is not true, which I encourage you to go watch. But the short version is as follows. The baby in utero, and by the way, fetus is just the scientific term for that stage of growth. So the baby in utero has his or her own thumbprints, human DNA, cellular reproductivity, human parentage, brain activity, genitalia, and the potential of variance in blood type. As a prime example of this last one, I actually have a different blood type from my biological mother. So, to put it another way, if that baby were to be tested, even in the womb, his or her genetic markers and his or her physical attributes would be distinguishable as a separate entity from the mother's. And if the two are a distinguishable and separate entity from one another, that must mean that they are not the same. And since they are not the same, but two separate individual humans, bodily autonomy kicks in. Now, for another way to reimagine it, I actually knew a woman who was pregnant with identical twin boys. If those boys had been a part of her body, she would have had spontaneously grown 2 sets of male genitalia, 20 extra fingers, 20 extra toes, and multiples of every single internal organ, but only for 9 months until her boys were born. Obviously, that is ridiculous. Those 2 boys were not only a separate human individually from her, but they were also separate humans from one another. Once again, bodily autonomy kicks into gear. Now, counter-argument 3, which counters the concept that the fetus is a parasite and can therefore be killed. Before we get into the counter-argument, I find it fascinating that the pro-choice world has this incessant need to dehumanize the preborn child. I think that the reason for this is because the second that the child is not being actively dehumanized, it becomes impossible to ignore the reality that you cannot unhuman a human. And that carries a lot of weight, especially for a woman who might be facing a pregnancy she wasn't planning, or maybe she feels like she's in an impossible position. So, back to the preborn child being a parasite. First, by calling the child a parasite, you're forced to acknowledge that it is separate from the mother. Because, just in case you didn't know this, by definition, a parasite cannot feed off of itself. Parasites have to be feeding off of something else. So they have to be a biologically distinct organism. Now, the next part comes from actualthinking.com. It lies within something called a corollary, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that it's a deduction or an inference or a natural progression of something. And it goes a little bit like this. While you can kill a non-human life that is living off of a human, which is what most people think of when they think of a parasite, you cannot kill a human life that is living off of another human. And the reason why is because that human life that's living off of the first human also has a right to life, which loops back into bodily autonomy. Additionally, with a regular animal parasite, you did not consent to its presence. But the overwhelming majority of pregnancies occur through willing and consensual intercourse between two people. And when it comes to intercourse, the only way to absolutely guarantee that there won't be a pregnancy is to not engage in sexual activity. Oh yeah, I know it's an unpopular opinion, but it is true nonetheless. Otherwise, you know the risk that you're possibly taking on. You might not think it's high, but you know it. A different way of thinking about this is that, say you're going to participate in a super dangerous activity. Now you know that you could hurt yourself if you participate in this activity. But what you can't do is argue that because you didn't want to hurt yourself, that you're not responsible if you do. That would be absurd. So the same thing applies here. If you are willing to take the risk of creating a human being who needs to live off of you, you cannot argue that you can kill that person due to them being parasitic. So that sums that up. You have bodily autonomy. Or to sum up, you have bodily autonomy, but so does every other human on the planet, including the ones in the womb. So either the standard applies all the way across the spectrum, or it does not apply to anybody at all. If you want bodily autonomy, which we all should, and yeah, everyone I know claims bodily autonomy, you have to be willing to apply the same deference to the most helpless among us, aka the preborn child. And now for this week's book recommendation. So it is called Pro-Life Answers to Pro-Choice Arguments. It was written by Randy Alcorn, and it might sound familiar if you've been watching this channel for a bit, because I've actually referenced this book on a couple of past videos. But now I'm actually actively recommending that you read it. What it does is it delves further into not just the bodily autonomy argument, but so many more arguments. And you can find it in all of the usual places. It's an absolutely incredible read. Now, up next, my favorite part of every episode. If you are facing a crisis or an unplanned or maybe even an unwanted pregnancy, or maybe you know someone who is, or maybe you have questions and you want to talk with me, no matter what it is, please reach out. Whoever you are, I can get you connected to the proper resources and I can answer any questions that you might have. My contact info across all the various social media platforms is somewhere on this screen. Please reach out to me. And now, for what's coming up next week, we're going to look at the reality of miscarriage. Because I think that it's going to do a lot of true good to shed light on what happens to a woman when she loses a child in the womb, involuntarily. For now, have a fantastic and blessed and safe rest of your week. And never forget how precious and how beautiful and how loved you are in the eyes of our Savior. And I challenge you to live as though it is true, because I promise you that it will completely revolutionize your world. Until then, let's continue to be pioneers in the space between the picket lines together. Thank you much for joining me.